Hi there, I'm Corey Driver, and this is Moving Forward. So this week we're in Matthew 22, again, starting in verse 15. And this is the section that's really known as the four questions. The lectionary reading only has the first of the four questions, but I'm going to throw in an extra just as a bonus. Enjoy. The tradition of the four questions will be known to anybody who's participated in a Passover Seder. The tradition of the four questions is preserved in the Mishnah, the very earliest of rabbinic documents, and it itself preserves an older tradition. So the four questions that are asked on Passover are not the four questions that are asked of Jesus. We know that. But the four questions that are asked of Jesus follow a specific pattern. Preserved in the Talmud, there's an interrogation of Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah by the citizens of Alexandria, and they ask four questions. A question about wisdom to discern the proper response to an issue of purity, a vulgar and insulting question about a woman with multiple husbands, a question of prioritization of laws, and a question meant to elicit truth through stories. This is exactly what Jesus faces in this chapter. And so this week and next week, we'll be talking about the four questions. We need to remember that the chief priests, some Sadducees and some Pharisees, have already decided that they need to get rid of Jesus. The only question is how to do it. There is a problem, and the problem is the crowd, the mob, who side with Jesus against the authorities. And so the authorities are not able to just kill Jesus. Eventually, they will capture him at night to try to avoid the crowds that hold that Jesus is at least a prophet and maybe the Messiah. So what they do in the meantime is try to discredit Jesus in front of the very same crowd that is protecting him. And so the way that they do that is by asking these questions. The desire to get rid of Jesus makes very strange friends. So some Pharisees come together with Herodians, and these folks would have hated each other, couldn't stand each other. The Pharisees are trying to live into God's call to ritual purity as a way to prevent another exile. And so they're making fences around the law and making sure that you don't even violate the protections that protect the law. And so just punctilious in observing law as a way of loving God and protecting the whole nation, right? And so they get a bad rap for going a bit overboard, but the point is they're trying to avoid another exile. They're trying to protect the nation. They think back to the great prophets and they say, well, we did these things wrong, and so God exiled us. So let's make sure we don't do anything wrong and be super careful to avoid it. The Herodians are allied with Rome. They are participating in all kinds of idolatry, erecting golden statues of various animals, and doing all this nasty business. They themselves are not ethnically Jewish. They're Edomites. And so they, been forcibly converted by the Hasmoneans a couple generations back. And so a really problematic agreement between two groups that otherwise would hate each other. But number of both of them come together to persecute Jesus publicly, to make the crowds not like him. So they say, Jesus, we know that you teach the truth, and we know that you show deference to nobody and partiality towards none. So answer us this. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, in this question, there's a lot, right? The province of Judea, along with the surrounding areas, have been conquered by Rome. Rome expands its empire essentially to expand its tax base and to expand its access to resources. And so Rome has conquered an area, they demand taxes, and the taxes fund further conquest of other areas. They literally pay the legions. And they also pay for all the public works. So we think about Roman roads, cool, but also Roman temples, also Roman aqueducts that have statues of various gods and goddesses and whatnot. They fund all sorts of activities that would be incredibly problematic for anyone trying to follow God's law. Violence and subjugation on the one part, and rank idolatry, public venues where gladiator violence or even sexualized worship in Roman temples. So just really kind of icky situations. And that's what the money goes to fund when you pay Roman taxes. So you're essentially paying for things that you regard as sin. And then the very coin itself carries the image of Caesar and proclaims Caesar to be a god or a son of the gods. So also really, really problematic. So there's a question of purity here. Like, what do? You can't fund this stuff. You can't maybe touch these coins even. But to say don't pay the taxes means you're starting an insurrection. Rome's whole point in coming to the area was to get the resources, one way or another, or actually both in all ways, to extract wealth from the land. So taxes and then just actually harvesting resources. And so if you say don't pay taxes to Rome, Rome takes that pretty seriously. Some Pharisees and some Herodians have Jesus in a pickle. Answer one way, then you're allowing ritual impurity and worse. Answer another way, and they have you. You're openly advocating against Rome, and so you can be put to death and all that. Jesus is in a tough spot in this question about ritual purity. And so he says, show me one of these coins. They show him a coin. Caesar's image is on it. So Jesus says, look, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. And I don't think here he's talking about paying the taxes. I think what he's talking about here is divest from this empire, from the economy that supports all these things, right? Give it back and don't take anymore, right? Don't participate in that. Then he says something even more interesting. He says, and then give to God what is God's. And we have to see the parallel here. So the image of Caesar is stamped on the coin, the denarius, and so it must be rendered to Caesar. But then what is God's? Well, it's the thing that God's image is stamped on. And if you go back to Genesis 1:26 and 27, the thing that God's image is stamped on is the human, all the humans. So the call to give to Caesar what is Caesar's is divest from that economy that supports bloodshed and sexual immorality and all this other stuff, dehumanization. Get out of that. But also render unto God that which is stamped with God's image, which is to say the human body, the human self, right? And so Jesus is making this radical claim about who's in charge of what. Yes, by all means, give idolatrous coins back to Caesar. Fine. But you have to give your whole life to God. And we all, a lot of times, miss that second part, the greater point that this question and answer is making. So then we turn to the second question. And this isn't in the lectionary, so feel free to skip if you want. But it's the question of the Sadducees. They come and they say, look, we've got a question for you in order to defame Jesus in front of the crowd so that he can be more easily arrested without resistance by the crowd that is protecting Jesus. And so their question involves the institution of levirate marriage. Think like Deuteronomy 25. The institution of levirate marriage provides that if a man is married and he dies without having any children to carry on his name, then his brother should marry the first man's widow in order to have sons, especially, but also daughters, who will carry on the name of the dead man. So the Sadducees use this to ask Jesus an impossible question. So a man marries a woman, he dies, no children. The woman marries the man's brother. He also dies, no children. And so on, there's 7 brothers. They all get married, they all die. And then they say, whose wife will the woman be in the resurrection? Now, the whole point is that Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. It's not in the first 5 books of the Bible, and it isn't. We don't believe in it, right? They are very strict constructionists, like no room for adapting and coming to learn more about the world to come. And so they just say, look, you die, you rest with your ancestors. That is it. That's all we know. And so they're poking fun at Jesus's idea of the resurrection. And it wasn't just his, to be sure. And so again, Jesus responds to this question meant to humiliate him and isolate him from the crowds with some really impressive wisdom. He says, you don't know. In the world to come, humans will not marry or be given in marriage. So, that's the answer to your question. She's not going to be anybody's wife because humans aren't going to do that sort of thing. But more importantly, you've misunderstood Scripture. God's self-introduction to Moses and other places, God introduces God's self as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, God is not some sort of God of the dead, like Hades, for instance, but is God of the living. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are to be regarded not as dead, but as alive with God somehow. And Jesus doesn't spell that out entirely, but uses this question meant to humiliate him to actually, we can say, humiliate those who would ask him. So the whole point of this section of the Gospel of Matthew is people trying to remove the protection and care of the crowd from around Jesus. But what happens instead is that they're amazed. Twice in response to these questions, it says the people were astonished or amazed. And that is the response to Jesus. In our own day, then, these stories should help us to be cautious and careful about times when those in power seek to humiliate others when they can't use outright violence against them. The violence of rhetoric to dehumanize those who would raise a challenge or ask a question of power and authority is ancient. This stuff has been going on at least since the gospel, right? And probably before that. So it should make us sensitive, and it should make us wonder about how rhetoric is used to undermine those doing God's work and calling for love of neighbor and justice and righteousness, as Jesus is doing here. So this week was the first half. We'll talk about some more questions next week. Until then, take care.